What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we're here with Age of Revelation, the Radioactive Spider-Man tie-in. Now, if you don't know what Age of Revelation is, we'll talk about that here in a second, but what this does is this picks up with Miles traveling through Revelation territory alongside Spider-Gwen. And one of the things they talk about is how the injection they have protects them from what's basically the X-virus for 26 hours. And that protection started the instant they injected themselves. So they probably have more like 24 hours, give or take a little bit. That's kind of standard when it comes to like, take this injection, it'll protect you, that kind of cliche. But one of the things that Gwen asks is she's like, when is the last time that you were here? And Miles says 8 years ago. And she asks, were you here for Peter? And he says, yeah, it didn't go very well. And so one of the things this establishes is that there's bad blood between Peter Parker and Miles Morales, because what it does is it jumps back to Revelation Day. Now, kind of an explanation here for what's happening with the Age of Revelation, if you need a reminder. Doug Ramsey, also known as Cypher, was basically chosen to become like the new herald of Apocalypse, right? Kind of the guy that represents Apocalypse's goals, machinations, different things like that. Doug Ramsey had unleashed the X-virus on Earth, which served two purposes. The first one was to quite literally begin the process of terraforming the world to essentially turn it into a new Krakoa. The second thing that it did was not that dissimilar from the Terrigen bomb back in the days of Inhumanity, if you guys remember that, which is to say the X-virus started mutating people. Now, these people who were mutated, it wasn't simply just because they had an X gene that was never activated. No, it literally modifies their genome. And that's what you kind of get here, right? You pick up with Peter Parker rescuing a mom and her daughter during Revelation Day when all this craziness is starting to kick off. And he says it's funny how crystal clear things become when the world loses all meaning. We thought we had time. We thought someone could stop the 3K transmutation virus. But that's the funny thing about exponential growth. One day, it's a problem way over there. The next day, your city falls apart beneath you. Now, the reason why it's referred to as the 3K transmutation virus is because, as we talked about in one of the previous videos that we did for Age of Revelation, 3K was an organization that basically created mutants. And when the entire virus kicked off, Revelation literally blamed it all on 3K. So everyone assumes that they're the ones who did it. And for the most part, only those who were in the know knew at the very beginning it was Revelation the entire time. And so what ends up happening is that when Peter saves this mother and her daughter, he calls MJ, right? Because you're in the midst of pandemonium, the city's falling apart. Of course he's going to call his loved ones. And when MJ picks up, right, she's just like, Peter, where are you? And he says, a few blocks away, I have to help someone, and then I will be there. And that's where this little girl starts talking about how she doesn't feel so good. Her mom just starts mutating and just spewing all over this girl. The girl in turn develops powers and fires them back at her mom, and basically blows her mom apart. And that's when MJ says, listen to me, it's May, something's happening. And that's where Peter is like, I'm coming, get to the roof. And so at that point, he swings back home and he says, humans were either dying or mutating. Buildings were crumbling or transforming. As horror after horror unfolded, a thought pounded with each passing heartbeat. And he just thinks to himself, right, MJ, where are you? And when he shows up there to try to find MJ, he says, when will I turn or die? Or worse. And so when he gets inside, he's hunting for MJ and he's hunting for Aunt May. And when he gets in there, he sees Aunt May standing there and essentially pieces of Mary Jane Watson everywhere. And at that point, we jump back to what's happening right now. And so in the present day, while Miles and Gwen are on their way to see Peter Parker, you pick up with Spider-Man in the aftermath of basically helping out a mutant by the name of Fuse, who was essentially doing like some rogue terrorist stuff, if you want to call it that, right? Doing what he could to kind of take pot shots against like the forces of Revelation and so on. But one of the things that Peter talks about here is where his life is in the here and now. And he says, I always liked the village. It embodied something different from the chaos of Times Square or the exclusivity of the fancy areas. Even after the year-long Manhattan Massacre, the reconstruction, and the rise of Revelation's gene-based caste system, the village is alive. We don't call it the village anymore because, second only to resilience, New Yorkers excel at giving dumb nicknames to neighborhoods. I don't know if that's true or not. But he says Highside enjoys the favor of Revelation, resources, and a population of quote-unquote pure mutants. Lowtown is everything else, good and bad. It feels like home. And so when you pick up with Peter, he's actually meeting with Celia Reyes. Now, Celia Reyes is an old school mutant from way back in the day. She originally debuted during Operation Zero Tolerance from Scott Lobdell. The idea behind her is she creates force fields. Now, if you end up getting Celia Reyes confused with Joanna Cargill, don't feel bad. I do it all the time. They look very similar all the way down to the hairstyle, especially when Celia Reyes is done up. But one of the cool things about this is that when she meets with Spider-Man, as you could tell, he's physically mutated, right? Radioactive Spider-Man, the name rings true. And he says the kid wants to be an X-Man, the good kind, right? Talking about Fuse. And she says, right, you didn't tell me that you were back, Peter. And she says, you haven't cleared the exposure window. And of course, Peter goes and starts making out with her, right? He's like, which is bad because I also use a Q-tip in my ear. But what you end up learning is why he's physically mutated in the first place. What's going on with him? Because she says, I can't make out with you after I give you your treatment. And so Peter says, we call it treatment. The euphemism keeps Celia from screaming. My cells have always been slightly radioactive. As a result, it takes longer for the X virus to attack my DNA. I figured correctly that more radiation would equal more resistance. It took a while, but we dialed it in so that a dose lasts me a few weeks. Then I start coughing up blood. Rinse and repeat. Then the blood comes from different places, but it's all worth it. And he says, besides being an exceptional doctor, trauma surgeon, and kisser, Celia is also a mutant, right? Force fields, impenetrable, though she does feel the impacts. If she feels the radiation that seeps out of me after treatment, she's never once complained. And so there is a little banter between the two of them. But one of the things this establishes is that they are in love, right? This is not some kind of a fling. It's not one of these things where Peter Parker lost MJ and now Celia's a rebound and she's kind of okay with it because, I don't know, she's just kind of living her hot girl summer. They're actually in love with each other. And that's why it makes her sad when she acknowledges the fact that this is going to kill Peter Parker. It's only a matter of time before he dies. And so what ends up happening is that an alarm kind of comes out here. And there's a question, right? That's a new one. Is there a leak in the reactor? And that's when Peter says no, right? It's not the reactor. And when they start poking around, they realize it's at the other lab. And this is when stuff starts to go off the rails. Because Peter's just like, we have to get there. Like, I have to get there and I have to respond. There's a sense of panic and dread here, right? Like, I need to show up here. If I don't, bad things are going to happen. And where Celia tells him, right, like, you are too weak, you have to sleep this off. He says, 5 biosigns, Cecilia. How am I going to sleep? Knowing that, because the implication seems to be that whoever shows up in this lab, they don't know what they're dealing with and they're going to get themselves killed. And so that's when you pick up with what are essentially the Marauders, right? Now, the Marauders, within the context of this story, they're a throwaway team. Sinister does have his own team as part of Age of Revelation. It's called Sinister 6. So it's like Omega Red and a handful of other people. But these guys just kind of allow the story to happen for the most part. But they do give us some pretty important statements here, right? They say, this belongs to us. They tried hiding the riches of our kind away amid the trash, but the Marauders will not be denied. They thought we were bashing low-town garbage from before, but as they're kind of going back and forth, the leader literally says Sinister had a number of labs like this one hidden throughout the world. The historical value of this equipment for our movement cannot be overstated. We cannot let Mr. Sinister's legacy rot down here under the purview of the impure. And so he just says, take what you can, keep it intact. And what happens is exactly what you would expect it to. It's one of these things when once they start activating and unlocking everything, everything starts to hit the fan. Because Peter shows up here, right? And he says, I'm only going to say this once, so open your ear holes wide. Get out of here or you will die. And they literally reject him, right? They're just like, no, you can't tell us what to do. It's the wide-eyed, naive people who have just convinced themselves that they know what they're doing. All the while, they have no clue what's going on. And so Peter just kind of starts asking questions, right? You cut the power. Why would you cut the power of this place? And so as the fight starts to drag on, Celia shows up here helping Peter as best she can, but she says, you should hurry. If my force fields take another hit like that, it's nap time, right? Wrap this up fast. But again, the fight goes on. These Marauders believe they're in the right. They're messing with things they don't understand. And Celia says that, right? Because when the leader of the Marauders says, there must be some hell of a treasure if these race traders are risking their pathetic lives to protect it, Celia calls him an idiot and then tells him, we came here to save you. Peter came here to save you. Because in that moment, the door smashes down. And Peter says, everything I learned that matters, I learned in this city. New Yorkers stand up for each other, even if we don't particularly like one another. Because when push comes to shove, life is precious. And just like this monstrosity of a being comes out of the cell and just kills the leader of the Marauders on the spot. And then Peter just says, it's over in 83 seconds. I force myself to watch. I cannot stop shaking. Celia is so scared, her nails break skin on my shoulder. She finally lets go when I say, it's all right, right? Everything's going to be okay. And so Peter approaches the person who has come out of this cell, and it turns out it's Aunt May. It's Aunt May. Right now, here's the crazy thing. It's not, I told you guys, it's wild. Here's the crazy thing. Peter just says, right, hey there, pretty lady, did you have a nice nap? And she just says, oh yes, right, I feel quite refreshed. Why are you in that outlandish costume? And Peter just says, right, you never turn your back on your family. And he's like, oh, it's just a Halloween costume, right? It's scary, right? You know, it's not a great big huge deal, right? It's Aunt May acting the way Aunt May always has. And in fact, just before Miles arrives on the scene, we kind of get this moment between Peter and Aunt May here, right? Where she kind of talks about her state of mind, right? And she's like, it's such a terrible feeling. You read the first few chapters of a book and then suddenly it hits you that you might have already read it, but you're not sure, right? Never get old, Peter. And Peter's just like, oh, not me, pretty lady, forever young. How do you feel? And she's like, oh, a bit tired. You know, I know that it isn't a long trip from Queens to Manhattan, but everything's just softer these days. But then she catches herself and she's like, wait, I don't live in Queens. That was where we raised you, right? And he says, yeah, like my favorite place on earth. And she's like, that tiny house? No, your home is so big, right? Dark and dusty. In a lot of ways, she's showing signs of Alzheimer's, signs of dementia, where she's kind of forgetting who she is, or she's catching herself in these moments when her mind thinks that something that's happened is actually happening right now, confusing moments in time over the course of her life. But there's also a far darker element here. Because when she starts talking about Mary Jane Watson, she catches herself and she kind of starts to mention how MJ is dead, and Peter cuts her off, right? No, she moved a while ago, right? It's all right. You know, I can't expect you to keep track of all the ladies in my harem. And of course, Aunt May's just like, oh yeah, like you are no Casanova. That was never the case, right? She's like, thank God you finally settled down with someone willing to put up with your nonsense. And Peter, understanding what's going on here, but Aunt May basically being blissfully aware, just says, I love you, Aunt May. You never gave up on me. I will never give up on you. And so that's what leads into the fight between Peter and Miles Morales. Because what Peter's doing is he's hunting for a way to quote unquote cure or fix Aunt May. We don't quite know what's wrong with her yet, but he's trying to find a solution. And so he ends up showing up at Rand Applied, what used to be Rand Industries, right? Danny Rand's company, the Iron Fist. And where he is ambushed by a handful of different guys, and they're kind of getting the upper hand on him because they're all incredibly capable and they're designed explicitly to combat someone like Spider-Man. Miles and Spider-Gwen show up on the scene. And Miles just says, right, I miss jokes. Remember jokes, Ghost Spider? And she's like, you make jokes all the time, Spin, just not when you're kicking the crap out of fascists. Now, here's a funny thing about Miles being called Spin in this comic. That's actually a throwback to the old animated kids show that he was in back in the day. They called him Spin. I love the nickname. I mean, Miles is what I'm always going to call him, but the nickname's kind of cool. But when he shows up here, he and Peter come face to face. And Peter asks, right, like, how are you here? Is there like a cure for this whole thing? And Miles just says, maybe if you come out of your hole once in a while, you would know the answer to that question, which is that there is no cure. Now, of course, Gwen is kind of playing referee between the two of them, at least for the moment. And where, you know, backup and whatnot is called in, basically Miles, Gwen, and Peter are able to hold their own and essentially take out pretty much all these guys and then make their escape. But that's where things start to go sideways, because Peter says, it sort of feels like you want to hit me, right? I want to hit me sometimes too. I'll give you a freebie. And initially Miles says no, right? Like you would never get back up again. And he says the Avengers need you out west. all the way out west. And Peter's just like, Miles, right? Make sure you get a bagel for the trek home. They're better than you remember. And Miles just kind of responds. He's like, do you have any idea what we had to do to get out here to find you? And Peter's just like, I mean, I can imagine, but my family's here. And Miles just says like, we used to be family too. Celia will understand. And Peter just says, May's awake. And in that moment, Miles loses it and is like, that's why you're still here? And just immediately starts attacking Peter Parker, just pummeling this guy. And Peter's trying to fight him off, right? He's like, Miles, stop, right? And Miles is just like, you said she was dead. My whole family died and you're still trying to save Aunt May? And he's like, how many people have to suffer, Peter? How many people have to die? Because you will not accept the truth of the world that we live in. And Peter just puts the haymaker on Miles, right? Just cold cocks him. And he just asks, right? If it was your mother, would you leave her behind? Would you abandon her like you're asking me to abandon mine? And the reality here is the answer is no, right? Miles Morales would do whatever he had to do to save the life of his mother. So it's one of these situations where it's Miles coming from this perspective, being able to understand it in his own way, but he and Peter handle things very differently. I would go so far as to say Miles Morales has not really experienced loss the same way Peter Parker has. Miles lost his mom in the original Ultimate Universe, right? She was killed by Venom back in that storyline. He's lost people close to him, right? It's not to say that he hasn't experienced loss, but Peter Parker's entire life is nothing but tragedy and loss. Peter Parker has lost Gwen Stacy. He lost his Uncle Ben. He has lost Harry Osborn, I don't even know how many times, right? He's lost himself before. He's been confronted with clone sagas, which I guess technically Miles Morales has, but the struggles of Peter, I would argue, drastically outweigh the struggles of Miles. And so for Miles to suddenly come along and just say like, yeah, you should 100% give up your mom. No, Peter can't handle that. And Peter's not willing to tolerate that. And so that's when Gwen steps in, plays referee again, and says, look, I'm so glad that this reunion went as chill as we predicted, but Pete, we came a long way, and you have to listen to us before you kick us to the curb. And Miles really doesn't like Peter because he's like, I mean, forget him, right? If that's his whole thing, he's staying here in the city of New York for Aunt May, this woman that cannot be saved, then let him stay here, right? Let him just suffer and die with everybody else here. We'll just go back and deal with it. But Gwen cuts him off, right? She's like, zip it, tough guy, right? We're trying logic. And where Peter's kind of dismissive, he's like, whatever it is, someone else has to deal with that. Gwen shows him something. And Peter's just like, that's not real. There's no way it can be. And she just says, I'm sorry, but it is real, right? It has to be you, Peter. And so at that point, you have Gwen and you have Miles, and then you have Peter who go back and see Celia. And there's a lot of history there between these guys, right? A lot of experience and moments that they've shared over all this time. And so Celia's just kind of like, you know what? We're going to let the boys talk and work this out. And you and I are going to go get drinks and chill, right? We're going to go do our own girl talk, that kind of thing. And so Miles is just kind of like, man, you look terrible, right? And Peter just tells him like, I'm pretty much dying. So yeah, that makes sense. And he's like, I mean, you look great though. California agrees with you. And the kind of catching up they do are like small little things like that, right? Miles says like, come on, right? You are literally dying to stay here on a fool's errand. And Peter just says, right? If it was your mom, and Miles just says she would be dead with everybody else. Like, we are not promised a solution to every problem, Peter, a key for every lock. If we were, no one would have lost anyone on Revelation Day. And he says, you tried, Peter, you tried, and you hit the end of the road. I am sorry, but it's the truth, and you know it. And Peter just tells him, right, you don't know what that means, Miles. I cannot just let her go. And in that moment, Aunt May appears, and Aunt May just says, you died. Right? Gwen Stacy died. And Peter tells her, right? Like, well, no, it's not that Gwen Stacy, right? You're confused. Clearly it's not. She did die at the hands of the Green Goblin, but Spider-Gwen, as we all know, is from an alternate reality. But Aunt May just says, I went to her funeral, Peter. I know what I am seeing. And she says, Gwen died at the hands of that terrible Spider-Man. Who are you? Right? And at that moment, it's just like, help her down, Peter, right? Like, literally, Celia is like, you have to calm her down. And Peter's just like, Miles, get out of here. Like, you need to leave right now. And at that moment, Aunt May freaks out and just says, you died, and just morphs into this gigantic being that can only really even be described as nightmare fuel. And so in understanding what happened with Aunt May, what this does is it switches over to everything 2 years after the Age of Revelation had basically kicked off. And you pick up with Dr. Octopus, and he says, my time would be better spent expanding mutagenic fields, right? And he says, were it any other woman, right? Because Dr. Octopus was married to Aunt May. If I remember correctly, they got married, I believe. And he says, your aunt's primary mutation is responsive physical adaptation. Any threat triggers explosive cellular augmentation. Damage to her brain tissue means no control or awareness when she transforms. When stressed, she is essentially a tumorous amygdala with teeth, stronger and more impervious to physical damage than the Hulk. My anti-mutagenic field allowed capture, but May is only stable in this stasis chamber. There is no cure, only the unthinkable. And Peter's just kind of like, what are we missing? And Miles just cold cocks him, right? And he's like, you're missing everything, right? Millions of people died. Millions still need your help. And you are throwing the bodies of our friends at a problem that cannot be solved. How many people we love need to die until you accept the facts? May cannot be saved. And so then you jump back to when Aunt May is basically going haywire as this gigantic monster. He refuses to accept the fact that the only way to really save Aunt May is to put her out of her misery, right? To kill her, right? To put her down, because otherwise she's just suffering as this gigantic monster. And one of the things they have to contend with here is that with Aunt May transforming the way that she is, she's on a mindless rampage, and there are families 3 blocks in every direction. And so Peter has to face the facts here, that what's asked by Miles Morales is he says, would she want this, right? Would Aunt May want to continue living this fate that she's living now? And so what you get are these incredible flashbacks between Peter Parker and Aunt May when he's younger. The idea of him helping her go over what's essentially her will, right? Becoming the executor of her estate, the administrator of her estate. And the idea that Aunt May is just kind of like, no, right? Like, this should not be your job, right? This should be the job of myself to get these things sorted out. And this should be the job of somebody else, right? Some kind of an executor. You just need to be able to live your life. And where he looks to guys like J. Jonah Jameson, right? People like that. Well, in this moment, it really is Jonah more than anything, because Jonah in this flashback, right, was married to Aunt May. That the reality here is that Jonah is dead, and Mary Jane Watson, and Flash Thompson, Ricardo, Randy, the list goes on and on and on. And Peter just kind of convinces himself, there has to be something that I haven't tried. There has to be something that I haven't quite thought of yet. And what he says is that I've known Celia Reyes for over a decade. She's raised her voice in anger in combat that she never asked for. In battlefield triage, she has never cried out in panic, and she does, right? And that's where Peter's just kind of facing these two statements on either side. It's Celia Reyes freaking out, right? There's families everywhere, Peter. My force fields are not going to hold. It's Miles Morales telling him, how many people need to die until you accept these facts? And Peter just says, there is no cure, only the unthinkable. And that's when he has to come to terms with the reality of his life. Because at that moment he says, families, right? My family, my responsibility. And so in that moment, he attacks Aunt May, and she immediately starts focusing on him. And he says, drop the outer shield, Clea, please, right? And he just says, let's go for a walk, pretty lady, and leads Aunt May away. Now, initially, everybody kind of wants to go chasing after him, but for the most part, they're basically held back, right? It's like, no. Peter needs to be able to handle this. He does lead them on a merry chase against what's essentially the Marauders. A whole bunch of them get killed and smashed to pieces. It's not really all that important, but it kind of recollects and flashes back on these important life lessons that Peter learned from Aunt May. And it's this beautiful element to the relationship that you never really get to see. More often than not, when you see the life lessons that Peter learned at a young age, it usually comes from Uncle Ben, right? With great power must also come great responsibility, different things like that. But seeing that Aunt May was essentially a mother for Peter Parker, we know that, right, as the reader, but seeing it being addressed this way within the comic is beautifully done. Because Peter learns about the idea of like charity, right? And he asks the question like, what's charity? And Aunt May says, helping people in need. And he's like, well, I mean, what if they're not nice? And she says, then we might need to help those people even more, right? He says things like, Uncle Ben says that some guys don't listen unless you're ringing their bell, right? And she asks like, how did that work out for you, right? So not every problem can be solved with fighting. The experiences kind of go on and on and on and on. The idea of the two of them talking about death, passing on. And Peter's just like, so everybody dies? And she says, eventually. And then he just asks, what happens after? The question every child asks when they're learning about mortality for the first time. And she says, no one knows really, right? The last great adventure. Again, this entire conversation coming off the heels of the passing of Uncle Ben. And so he says, if you're going to die, then I think I want to come too. And Aunt May just says, no, I don't think so, right? You'll have a lot of living left to do. And so Peter, just kind of recollecting on this moment, just says, do the math. It's my aunt. The chamber is lined with lead, panels backed by 6 feet of concrete, buried 40 feet beneath the city. Override the fail-safes, right? She's my aunt. Flood the lab with radiation, 10,000 rads every half second. No one outside would be hurt, right? She's my Aunt May. It's my responsibility. No one other than her. She is my mother. And so in that moment, when she goes to attack Peter, Peter just says, you were right, May. I was not strong enough. I'm sorry. And like at that moment, immediately hits the button and fills the room with radiation and kills Aunt May. Like he literally puts her down, right? And so Miles comes swinging in and he's just looking into the room where Peter's in there with all this radiation. And Aunt May just says, you used to want to be an astronaut. That was a scary thought. And he says, I was 5, May. And she says, you're still 5 and a man and a baby. That's how parents see our children. And she says, I hope that you and Celia get to experience it one day. When your 5-year-old says that he wants to go to Mars, or says he wants to study science at Oxford, or he's fighting off crime in New York City, who will have 2 thoughts at the same time. The first, the loudest, will be, don't leave me. And the second, the quieter one, the strong kind of quiet says, thank you for sharing your life with me. Now go share it with the world. Thank you for making my life glorious, Peter, and for letting me go. It's crushing, right? Because she says, a mother could not have asked for a better son. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. I told you, it's an incredible story. It's beautiful. One of the best Spider-Man stories I've ever read. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.